And ultimately, what we want to talk about today, and welcome to those who have more recently joined, we want to talk about current financial processes that you're running within NetSuite, and specifically which of these processes might be limited by either, just arduous tasks, right? Anything that is repeatable, we can have AI help with, and that's what we're going to really focus on today. So Nanonets serves a really wide range of customers. We, of course, have many of these customers using NetSuite. And as I mentioned, we really want to be able to talk about how and which of these processes we're running in NetSuite and which of them might be available for us to help make this a little easier. So first and foremost, and this is certainly one of the most popular use cases that we deal with, is for accounts payable. So as many of you already know, right, running an accounts payable process with NetSuite can be a bit arduous. You might be receiving these invoices. You might have somebody who's manually extracting the data from these invoices and then manually inputting and matching this data back within NetSuite. We believe that this is sort of the exact use case that AI can help us replicate without the human intervention. Nanonets helps to run this process by actually taking these invoices, and we can automatically ingest these invoices. We can set up multi-stage approval processes, pay vendors on time, and all while keeping these records accurate for auditing, right? All this data will always be syncing back to your NetSuite instance. We'll look at an exact use case for this here in a few minutes. But ultimately, what we want to do is we want to use something like an AI tool, Nanonets, for instance, alongside NetSuite to make your accounts payable process super smooth, increase STP, reduce the errors, right, that might come from human intervention, and ultimately improve vendor relationships, more on-time payments. So that certainly doesn't help. What we'll look at as well is we'll look at some account reconciliation. So we deal with a lot of customers who are currently performing their rec process back to NetSuite, back to bank statements, and Nanonets can make this super easy, right? Again, utilizing AI. So the way that we do this is we can automatically perform 2- and 3-way matching of invoices, purchase orders, bank or credit card statements, or all your other financial statements, right, back to NetSuite to make sure everything is in running order. We want to also ensure that we're keeping compliance, right, and all records being synced back to NetSuite correctly. Since Nanonets is capable of extracting data from all document types, we're template agnostic, we can take whatever documents you're currently using, right? Bank statements, maybe checks, check balances, and everything else that we might need to use for reconciliation and sync back to NetSuite, making this super simple. We've also helped customers with payroll processing. This is a really important one as well because your payroll tool may or may not sit within NetSuite, right? If it sits outside of NetSuite, do those tools connect? These are all important questions that we should be asking. And we know that NetSuite is an extraordinarily capable CRM. We hopefully know that already. But payroll might sit outside of there. So, and payroll is also, as we see it, a very important part of your financial statements, right? An important component and expense. So payroll should sync up with all those other records, right? Be part of your NetSuite instance, and also maintain consistency. Any inconsistencies in the payroll or tax calculations, right? That's something that Nanonets can flag. Nanonets can find those discrepancies or inconsistencies and point them out to you before it's a problem, ideally making this process better and easier to manage. And then we also look at expense management, something that we do super frequently. So scanning of all the receipts, managing taxes and reimbursement of individual employees. We see a lot of teams struggle with this. Usually this is a super manual process, very labor intensive to ensure that there's checks and balances in place, approvals happen, things like that. With a tool like Nanonets, again, using AI, this couldn't be easier. Simply upload those receipts to Nanonets and let Nanonets do the rest. As I mentioned earlier, we can essentially extract all the data from these receipts, automatically trigger conditional approvals, right? Make sure that, hey, Jacob had this expense, make sure that we're tagging Jacob's boss or Jacob's superior to actually approve this expense. And then ultimately, once that expense is approved, we can sync all this back to NetSuite too. Very simple. We also do a lot with financial close processes, which some of you guys might deal with as well. And basically, we want to make this close as easy as possible. So since many of you probably already use NetSuite as your single source of truth, since we're extracting all the data from these bank statements, checks, and more, all these different document types, and syncing everything back to NetSuite, then you can essentially rest easy knowing that no data has been missed. Everything is in NetSuite. And more importantly, too, if we're using tools outside the NetSuite ecosystem, Nanonets allows us to sync all these tools together, even if that outside tool might not have a direct integration with NetSuite, right? So that kind of allows NetSuite to be, assisted by Nanonets as a sort of middleman. All right, and again, Nanonets, a lot of N's today. Nanonets will be here to create a seamless interaction, allow for any indiscrepancies or any mismatched data to be flagged right before it becomes a problem. So we're obviously big fans of NetSuite. We work very closely with NetSuite. We have many customers using NetSuite. And we like that NetSuite is generally very versatile, right? So it serves a large, broad function here, even outside of finance. It's a scalable tool, right? So we can use scalability from SMB all the way up to enterprise use. And we can also have plenty of flexibility, right? It's got modules, integrations, and things like that. We will be sending out a poll here in just a second. I believe that's coming from Sasang. We'd love to hear a little bit more about which of the specific finance processes you're looking to automate. We can, of course, then tailor this a little bit more to those use cases. So keep an eye out for that. I think it just went out. And as you're hopefully filling out that poll, we can talk a little bit about where are these limitations that we see with our current NetSuite customers. So just to highlight a couple of big ones here, high level. One is implementation. As you guys probably know from using NetSuite, this extensibility comes at a bit of a cost, right? It is super broad. It requires a lot of setup. And sometimes that setup can be pretty technical as well. It takes a lot of time and manual effort to set up. Also a cost, right? There's a large cost associated with this. Outside of the manual effort to set this stuff up, the native extensions, add-ons, integrations can also just be very costly. We also look at a manual effort. Like I said, it takes a lot of time to set this stuff up. A lot of the add-ons or modules aren't exactly ready to go out of the box, as we say, right? And even if they are, not all of it might be a one-size-fits-all sort of use case. So looking at what automation is currently available in NetSuite, and we can also compare this to some of our other options too. So here, just to name a few examples, right? You guys might have heard of SuiteScript and SuiteFlow. SuiteScript is a little bit more of a code that allows for additional functionality in fields to be allowed in NetSuite, whereas SuiteFlow is more of a workflow automation tool, at least in limited capacity. And we'll actually look at this here in a minute. Now, it's capable to set up approval, field updates, things like this. However, a limitation to both of these tools. Neither are AI powered, which means we're kind of at the mercy of what they've been coded to do. One, not super flexible. Two, they do essentially require quite a bit of manual effort to set up. And three, and this is where we see the biggest limitation, but both are limited to the NetSuite ecosystem. So they're not accessible outside the NetSuite ecosystem, which can be difficult, especially if you're using outside tools, right, outside of the NetSuite ecosystem. We can look at NetSuite modules as well, right? So NetSuite Bill Capture, NetSuite AP AR automation. These are a bit easier to deploy, and we've seen them work pretty well in the past. However, a couple downsides here to note. One is that NetSuite Bill Capture, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but NetSuite Bill Capture specifically uses a templated OCR. So essentially what this means, practically speaking, is that if you work with a variety of vendors, and each of these vendors most likely have a slightly different invoice format or template or language even. There, in those cases, we've seen accuracy really drop with NetSuite Bill Capture. Since it's based on a template, we need to now train the template for every single invoice and vendor format that we might get. With something like Nanonets, this is not required at all. Since we're using AI, we're essentially able to act template agnostic, right? And any invoice, by any invoice format, any invoice type, language, we're able to pull data from immediately. No training required. Also, similar that we saw with SuiteScript and SuiteFlow, these are also limited to NetSuite. So this won't connect or work with any tools outside of the NetSuite ecosystem. Which finally brings us to our third-party integrations. Of course, we'd like to plug Nanonets here, but Nanonets comes out of the box with all the bells and whistles. There's no coding required, so super easy deployment. You don't need to be an IT wizard to set this up. And we have the best-in-class AI, which essentially means that we can grab the data for these complex workflows and for your complex documents, whether it be an invoice or otherwise. Any format or document or language is going to work just fine here. Generally, if you're thinking, is this relevant to me? Well, we have a few steps to thinking about that. First and foremost is the planning and assessment. So first, we want to assess and figure out which business activities are consuming most of your time or might be most prone to human error. Then once you've kind of established that and say, oh, wow, these are, the processes are taking a lot of time or there's a lot of manual effort involved, maybe AI could help us in that. Well, then you'll want to start looking at a tool. Ideally, the more complex the need, right, the more complex your workflow is, the more versatile the tool should be to fit that. Thankfully, again, plugging Nanonets here, Nanonets is a great candidate for that. Nanonets is made to be out of the box to fit a huge wide variety of different workflows and different tools. So ideally, we can help you find one that works. And that moving kind of into the customization and integration, right? The tool must be able to accommodate your unique workflow and tool set. As I mentioned, Nanonets does this better than I've seen with any of our competitors because each workflow and each accounting workflow is like a fingerprint, right? We don't necessarily want to tell you, hey, you need to rip and replace your workflow because that's complicated. That's a lot of new training. It's costly, right? We don't want to do that. Ideally, Nanonets is a tool that can fit, or whatever tool you choose, can fit into your workflow seamlessly. Right? So finally, we'll go with a testing and deployment. Right? We want you to be able to test this, test the process, make sure it's going to be a good fit for your workflow, and that nothing's going to be too disrupted here. And we run proof of concepts here at Nanonets. We give you the opportunity to do that before making any lengthy commitments. So at this point in time, we'll take a quick pause here. We do have another poll that's coming out. We saw that accounts receivable was the highest, which is great. So we can see that. We can talk a little bit more about that too. The new poll that goes out goes a little bit more at what stage are you at or are you considering when you're looking into new AI tools. So we'll give a quick second to fill that out. In the meantime, we'll talk a little bit about how NetSuite and Nanonets actually work together. So I'm resharing my screen here. And what I want to do is I want to actually compare the workflow automation that we'll see with something like NetSuite and what we'll see with Nanonets. So we can really compare side by side of how the tools are working. So what you're seeing here, this should probably look pretty familiar to you guys. This is one of NetSuite's workflows that we're seeing. This is specifically a three-way vendor match that we've set up here. And what you'll see is we can create this workflow here. We have approval routing, right? We have a bill validation. We have some additional approval and validation down here, showing any exceptions, things like that. Now, keep in mind, and sort of the big takeaway here is all of this is happening within NetSuite. It's all local, right? So if you're using outside tools or you need a better way to alert your team for approval or validation, you don't have a lot of flexibility here to do that. Now, take a mental picture of this because we'll compare this to what Nanonets offers from our workflow. So first and foremost, as I mentioned, is extensibility. How accessible is the outside tools you're using to NetSuite available to you? Here in Nanonets, we have a plethora of them. Most of our customers, especially when we're dealing with invoices, are receiving these invoices by email. Nanonets allows us to grab these invoices directly from email as soon as they come in. Essentially, we have an auto forwarding setup, so there's not even a human touch that's needed here. As soon as your vendor, right, sends a PO or invoice to you, Nanonets is grabbing it automatically. We can also pull from maybe your vendor platform. That could be an API. And we can pull from any cloud-based storage system and many more. Super simple. We then have a model that's extracting that data, and we'll look at this in just a second. And then we have even more data actions here. Data actions essentially allow us to change, manipulate this data as we need, right? Can be as simple as a date format, could be all the way up to maybe we have QR codes or barcode scanning, we have search and replaces, checkbox detection, language model actions, things like that. Really flexible here. We also, and this is very popular among our customers too, and I'll show you use of this, we have lookups that happening. A lookup, and essentially what this is it's a lookup to an outside database from Nanonets. So Nanonets is grabbing data from your invoices, and perhaps we're doing a lookup to NetSuite. I've had a customer do this recently who is actually tracking the price of parts. They're fixing coffee machines, and we're essentially pulling the line items, right? Hey, here's the parts that's needed to fix this espresso machine. We're going to look up each of those costs by the line item, the item code, into NetSuite to track those stats, to understand, hey, our parts prices have gone up or gone down, or whatever it might be. And then ultimately, and I hinted at this earlier as well, is we can set up advanced multi-stage approval steps where we have multiple flags or rules that'll tag Honorban in this case, right? If invoice amount doesn't exist, or we have an invoice date that doesn't exist, maybe even, and this is very popular as well, maybe the invoice amount is greater than $5,000, right? If so, tag Jacob first, and then it might need approval from Jacob's boss or something similar. This is very flexible here. We can also send these flagging alerts and validation alerts to Slack, Teams, email, right? So really meeting your team where they are. And then ultimately the export to NetSuite. So let's take a look at an actual invoice that we've scanned in here. Here's our invoice, and you'll see that Nanonets extracted all the data from this invoice. You also see down here as well with the vendor name, Nanonets has automatically matched the vendor name here to one of our vendors in NetSuite. We have our line items down here as well, and a PO number match. We'll see that down here. Whoop, let's open this one. And we'll be able to see that we have all of our line items in here. Amounts match up, total looks good, everything we need. Now, let's say, for instance, this invoice doesn't match up. So if we have an invoice number here, 6742, we're going to rerun this action. You, of course, won't need to do this. This will happen automatically, but just for sake of showing this, we now see we have a flag here. Whoops, what happened? PO not found in NetSuite, right? So we had a no match here. Today, we're showing you this on a PO number level, but we could do this even for line items, right? If a line item doesn't match up, it's very flexible here. So essentially what would happen in a case like this is you might get a flag, Jacob's flag, to come in, correct this issue. If we correct this, this goes PO 12. Let's update this. Let's resync this. And we'll see here, flag is gone, PO is matched to PO 12. We can approve this file. And ultimately, we can send this back from a pending bill to being fully billed. Okay. So ultimately here, what we're wanting to do, and I'll jump back into my original presentation here, but ultimately what we're wanting to do here is ensure that there's a process with minimal human intervention, minimal error, but as much automation as possible, right? Really only flagging and tagging your team when it's absolutely necessary. So let's go back in here. All right, cool, here we go. And ultimately, just to recap that really quick, right? What did we just see? What happened? So essentially we had AI, right? AI is giving us that high level of accuracy, extracting all that data from that sample invoice that we looked at. Nanonets does this better with more flexibility than any other tool on the market. Doesn't matter the document type, right? Today we looked at it. Again, any document type will work just fine. Any type, format, or even handwritten notes, Nanonets can extract that data. Nanonets is versatile enough, right, to that point that we can essentially scan any financial document or beyond, passports, bank statements, right, anything, totally fine. and it's flexible. So as we saw in that workflow from Nanonets, we can pair with your ERP, your payments tools, your HRMS, right? And all these tools might change, and that's totally fine, right? Nanonets is flexible enough to accommodate that. And ultimately, I think this makes Nanonets a great tool for automating your financial processes and basically any business process that you might be dealing with. I want to hand things over to Christopher really quick here, just to talk a little bit about how Tigris has used Nanonets alongside NetSuite. We can talk a little bit more about the accuracy they've seen, what implementation was like, and all of those as well. What we want to cover here is Tigris is a fulfillment company, and they're based here in the U.S. And essentially they're a distributor in kitchen and bath segment. So what we saw here when just before they came on as clients is they were looking at a lot of manual data entry, nearly 40 hours per week. This was taking one full-time employee to actually capture all the data from their invoices. We had generally a tough time with data entry. So there were, due to just normal human error, bat fingering here and there, we had some incorrect data capture, right? Which ultimately led to errors down the road and delayed payments, right? Due to some incorrect information, which obviously created issues and turbulence for their team. Now, what Nanonets was able to do was essentially we wanted to digitalize all their invoice and PO information. So these were received in paper copies, scanned in, right, or received by email, and Nanonets was automatically extracting all that information. From there, what happened is we also looked into some additional workflows, ultimately to validate this data and ensure accuracy. So we created data enrichment. This, for example, can be very simple, like I saw back in our short demo where we had checking the vendor, right? So checking vendor historical data to NetSuite, things like that. If everything syncs up, ultimately pushing those invoices back to NetSuite. Ultimately, what we looked at here was we saved 40 hours a week for this team. We saved, the cost of one full-time employee, and data extraction accuracy actually went up from around 70% is what they were seeing up to 95% currently with Nanonets. Now, also to point out here, you might be thinking, what about the remaining 5%? Those remaining 5% are all fields that we're flagging. So, for example, if a vendor name doesn't match up with an existing vendor in NetSuite, or perhaps we have an invoice amount or total that doesn't match up to a purchase order, right, for doing PO matching. These are places where we're flagging these for human review in those remaining 5%. Ultimately, and Chris, unfortunately, isn't here to say this with his own words, but quoting him, right, they really need to reach out to us for support, but when they do, our response and service is good. We have customer success and support and activation managers, all across the globe, which essentially ensures that we cover all time zones. Even if you're on the West Coast and it's 11 o'clock at night, we have somebody maybe on the other side of the earth who's able to answer your questions. One more time to wrap this off, right? Many enterprise level customers are using Nanonets, right? Bosch, Cummins, P&G, Roche, they're here in the Midwest, I like to say them. Deloitte, EY, all using Nanonets. Hopefully we can add some additional companies and partners here today to that list. I'd like to go ahead and open things up for Q&A.
We have the first question. How are you different than NetSuite Invoice AI? Let me take that. Hi, thanks for your question. Historically with our customers, we have noticed that in testing cases where the invoice has a evolving format and there are handwritten notes, especially in transportation and other industries where this is much more common, our AI has shown to be much more better at its performance and still extracting the right details and syncing with NetSuite. So that's where our AI, which is fairly proprietary, is much better than anything out there in the market. So that's one way we are much better, at least when it comes to tech performance and integrations and all, as we covered. There are many other advantages with NetSuite over advantages of Nanonets over the traditional NetSuite modules. And yeah, as I dropped the link on the chat. We are happy to discuss at further. I hope I answered the question to begin with.
Yes, and to formulate that, yeah. So the big difference is being the templated invoices, right? So we can see some bigger breadth of accuracy, especially among many different vendor formats, as well as the languages handwritten, and then finally for the extensibility outside of NetSuite. So if you're wanting to run workflows outside of that. Okay, it looks like we.
Another question. How well does Nanonets handle very large documents? I work for a third-party logistics company. We receive invoices from carriers that might have up to, oh my God, 400,000 lines in one huge document. I hope it's 400,000 line items, but yeah, Jacob.
Yeah. So in short, I mean, it's nothing out of the ordinary for Nanonets. So we do deal with clients who will have very big documents, sometimes thousands of pages. We work, I think I mentioned this earlier, but we work with hospital groups. We work with lawyers who can have very large documents. There's a few answers here and a few options. First and foremost, sometimes when we deal with these large document types, it might just be one PDF. It might be one CSV file. Like you said, you have a few lines. Really, it depends. So one thing that we'll do pretty frequently for large documents is generally these large documents are a compilation of many smaller documents. So Nanonets has an automated document splitter that will actually split this large PDF, right? Let's say it's 400,000 pages in this PDF. We'll split it into 100,000 4-page documents. So that's one way we handle this. The second way we might do this is, if this is true, it's like lines. This won't necessarily be 400,000 pages, right? It might just be 400,000 lines. That's across 40 pages. One of the things that we'll do in this case is for server times, generally our SLA is 2 to 5 seconds. Now, obviously with a large document, that'll be farther on the higher side of that. And what we do is we run this in something called an async, which essentially just ensures that our servers maintain good running times. It's the same if you use like your network on your phone. Network times will be a little bit slower when a lot of people are using it. So to ensure that we're not, if one customer uploads a 1,000,000-page document, it doesn't slow it down for everybody else. We'll essentially run it in what's called an async queue. So it'll run a little bit slower in the background, but generally it still shouldn't take longer than a few minutes. But it'll depend a little bit on what the document looks like and the amount of pages present in there. Hopefully that answers your question, Lorenzo. But in short, it's not out of the ordinary. We see that pretty frequently.
And we have one more question. Apart from invoice processing automation, which is reading invoices with requiring no manual intervention, are there any analytics provided?
Shashank, would you like to answer that, or would you like me to?
Yeah, I can quickly take it up. That yes, there are a fair bit of overview screens and analytics which we do deliver in terms of how many are yet to be reviewed, and if there's anything which is grabbing attention, and if there are further analytics which are required, this is something we can definitely discuss and take it up.
Yeah, and that is something that we do as well, especially for invoices, right? So this could be everything from analyzing spending, tracking paid and unpaid invoices, tracking invoices assigned to me, right? If there's specific flags that say, oh, Jacob's got to approve this invoice, there will be invoices waiting for approval, things like that. This is also something that we're actively building out as well, to do things like managing better relationships, managing taxes, things like that, tracking prices of items. I talked a little bit about that use case earlier. These are all ways that we're building out into the reporting that you'll be seeing from these invoices.
Yeah, that's all the questions we have currently. Thanks a lot, everyone, for attending the webinar. As I dropped again, we are happy to take the discussion forward. Our team, and very likely Jacob himself and me, will be there to discuss at length, depending on our timings, and we're happy to discuss it forward. Once again, thanks a lot for attending. Hope you found a lot of insight and action items to look into. We hope to hear back from you soon.